Hi, Craig.
Hello, Craig.
Hi, Greg.
Hi, Craig.
Long time no see, Craig.
And hello, everybody. Welcome to the paddock. Today we have a little bit of a long episode for you, but we're going to be talking about the very first time a driver has won their first Formula One race. Now, covering our favorites, we have Hanna, LeAnne, Amy, Melissa, and myself, Chelsea, on this episode. So I'm going to start it off and pass it to Melissa, who's going to begin in 2003.
All right, so we're first going to start on everyone's favorite anti-hero and his maiden win at the 2003 Hungarian Grand Prix, Fernando Alonso. Let's go. So Fernando started the race in P1 ahead of Ralf Schumacher in P2 and Mark Webber in P3. At the start, he had managed to get a 7-second lead ahead of P2 just in the first 3 laps. Then later having a 21-second lead in the first 13 laps. Iconic? I think so. However, he did pit and he did lose the lead, but only for a short amount of time. Not surprising because it is Fernando. And by the 16th lap, Fernando got the lead back as Kimi and the other drivers went into the pits. He then lapped Michael Schumacher in the later stages of the race, who ultimately ended in 8th place at this Grand Prix. Amazing for Fernando because Michael was leading the championship at this point of the season, and to overtake the leading champion is definitely a moment to remember. He finished the race in P1 with a 16.8-second lead ahead of McLaren Mercedes driver Kimi Räikkönen in P2 and Williams BMW driver Juan Pablo Montoya. In the post-race interviews, Fernando described the win as a dream come true. I am 22 years old and have my first victory. I hope to have a long career with lots more victories. He definitely manifested this for himself because look at him now, still killing the game. And the biggest moment to take away from this race was that Fernando broke Bruce McLaren's record of the youngest driver to win an F1 race at that time.
And moving on to Lewis, who at one point was our lovely Alonso's teammate. All right, well, Lewis took his first pole position in qualifying at the 2007 Canadian Grand Prix, and he was second in the Drivers' Championship going into the race weekend. I'm honestly going to start off by saying it's so surreal seeing them without halos at this point, and even hearing the engines of the car. It's crazy how different they've become even now. Okay, back to the race. Honestly, it was pretty chill of a race on Lewis's end. I mean, Alonso went off track initially and jumped back across, cutting Lewis off, but the icon that Lewis is didn't really seem to be too bothered. Another note to watching old races, though, no commentary and really limited team radios. I feel like in races now, we would have immediately gotten Lewis's radio after being cut off. There were 4 safety cars in this race. One was because of a really intense crash involving Kubica. Luckily, he walked off with just a sprained ankle and concussion, although Lewis's radio call at the end of the race said that he had a broken leg. But either way, just glad that's all it was. There was also a lot less pit stops, it seemed, as they just really waited a long while back then. Probably because the fastest pit stop was 6 seconds. Insane compared to now. Lewis was only not in the lead for the smallest amount of time, and that was because of his first pit stop. But watching this honestly gave me Max vibes now, where the midfield is just chaotic and Max is just chilling. Post-race, seeing how happy Lewis was, he was just jumping around like a little kid, even before he got out of the car. And seeing his father contain his excitement, or attempt to, was just heart-melting. Lewis praised the car, as he still does, and I just always love when the drivers give the love out to the team. Though he did point out that the safety cars made the race a bit boring for him, leading him to send his thoughts and prayers to Kubica. Lewis took the lead from Alonso in the Drivers' Championship from this race, which was also McLaren's/Mercedes' 150th podium. And of course, that angel that Lewis is, he dedicated this win to his father. The big moment that I took from this race was Lewis is the first black driver to ever win a Formula One race. He got a race win quicker than anyone expected. It only took him 6 races. Plus, add in that this win gave him the lead in the championship at just 22 years old. I'm pretty sure at 22, all I achieved was my bachelor's degree and first PA job of my career. I can tell you Niki Lauda would not be as stunned by my achievements as he was Lewis's.
Now, we're going to jump to 2014, the Canadian Grand Prix, and Daniel Ricciardo. Now, this should surprise absolutely nobody that I jumped on the opportunity to rewatch Danny's first race win. I remember watching this in a college dorm room with a bunch of friends, and it will forever and always be one of my favorite races to watch. And he started in 6th and been beaten in qualifying by his teammate at the time, Sebastian Vettel, for the second time in 2014. And it was actually his worst qualifying of the season to date. Now, the race was pretty standard, but on the 66th lap of the race, Danny used DRS and steered into the outside to pass Checo for second, entering into turn 1. He actually went onto the grass at the corner, and that caused Sebastian Vettel to nearly hit Checo's car. And with this race, as I said, it was pretty standard, but the final lap was just kind of chaos. We saw Felipe Massa's front right tire and Checo Perez's left rear wheel collide, which caused Checo to ram into a barrier at 32 Gs, which is a little crazy. And Massa narrowly avoided colliding with Sebastian Vettel en route to a tire wall at an impact of 27 Gs. And when I tell you that this crash will forever have my jaw on the floor, I was literally giving cartoon character level jaw drop. I've rewatched this race multiple times, and I still really cannot get over how Sebastian managed to avoid that crash. And you even hear his race engineers going, how did he miss this? How did he manage to avoid this? The crash obviously brought out a safety car, which neutralized the race and allowed Danny to take his first career victory. It was the first Australian to have a victory since Mark Webber won the 2012 British Grand Prix. Final podium for that race was Danny in P1, Nico in P2, Nico Rosberg for those who may not realize, and Sebastian Vettel in P3. After the race, Danny was in shock over his first career win. And I quote, "This is ridiculous. Lots of Aussie flags. That's nice. Just an amazing feeling right now. I'm really grateful for this. Thanks, everybody." In true Danny fashion, he's just always going to give people the kudos that they deserve. Now, I'm also going to keep going. Sorry, everybody. Grab a drink. You're going to have to hear me talk a little bit more. We're going to move on to 2016 with the Spanish Grand Prix and Max Verstappen's first win. But before we go in, I do have to give you a little bit of backstory. We saw silly season kick off real early this year with Daniel Kvyat and Max Verstappen actually trading places ahead of the race. Max moved over to Red Bull Racing while Kvyat returned to Toro Rosso. Christian explained the drivers' swap, citing Max's talent, saying that the 18-year-old Dutchman and Danny Rick had the potential to become Formula One's best driver pairing. Well, I think a lot of us can agree, it's kind of one of our favorite pairings for sure. He also stressed that Verstappen's move to Red Bull would tie him to the team for the foreseeable future. Now, Kvyat seemed pretty surprised by the decision, saying during Thursday's press conference that he was shocked by his demotion, stressing that Red Bull didn't really give him a, quote, real explanation. Well, I don't really love the way that Red Bull handled that driver swap. It is what it is. But with the race, we got to see Sebastian Vettel getting past Max, immediately getting repassed on the approach to turn 4. It was a pretty standard race. We did have a safety car period, which caused the order to stand as Danny in first, Max in second, Carlos Sainz in third, Sebastian Vettel in fourth, and Kimi Räikkönen was chilling in fifth. Now, the race was pretty standard, but we did have a few bits where there was some chaos. We saw Carlos Sainz and Jenson Button be the first to come into the pit lane for new tires on lap 12, followed by race leader Danny Rick 1 lap later, which made Max Verstappen the first Dutchman to lead a Grand Prix before he came in a lap later for new tires himself. Now, as we get to the finish line, of course, we get Max Verstappen crossing the finish line to become the youngest driver and the very first Dutch driver to win a Formula One race.
So I'm going to be recapping Valtteri Bottas's first Formula One race win, and this happens when he's 27 years old. It is April of 2017, and we are at the Russian Grand Prix. Now, this is during his time with Mercedes as Lewis Hamilton's driving partner, and he's actually in his first year with the team. Now, the race itself was not an easy win for the man, but it was definitely one that had him in the lead pretty comfortably. Starting third on the grid in second row, he was following a pretty strong quali, and we actually had the Ferraris on the front line with Seb and Kimi. Now, Valtteri was really gunning for a win here. And honestly, I don't know what was in his car that day, but by the time they passed the first corner on the first lap, he was already overtaking the Ferraris. He held on to this position, setting the fastest lap in the race on lap 16, but there were a few hiccups during the Grand Prix. We had Alonso with a DNF for a tech issue, causing another grid start, which Valtteri once again was beating out the Ferraris in turn 1. And then there was a crash between Romain Grosjean in the Haas and Renault's Jolene Palmer, which brought out a safety car, and that caused another restart, which once again helped Valtteri win the race because he was able to take a better lead ahead of Vettel and get out of that DRS zone. We also got to see him get a rightly deserved Driver of the Day and absolute love from the news. It did take more than 80 races for this P1 position though, so you know what? Understandable. At the time of the race, he had only been signed in for a 1-year contract at Mercedes, but we had broadcasters asking Toto for a pen and a multi-year contract for him to sign on the spot after this race. Now, he did end up moving up to third in the Drivers' Championship behind his teammate Lewis, who was in second. And I want to note that this race, plus a few others between him and his teammate in Mercedes, did help them beat out Ferrari at the end of the year with 668 points. If you didn't know, Toto got that contract and he stayed with the team until 2021. In the end, I will admit, while this was a great race to watch if you're a Valtteri fan, it wasn't really interesting in terms of a race I would rewatch again. I do recommend giving it a watch though if you're new to F1 and just want to see what this man can do.
So I'm going to be covering the Charles Leclerc 2019 Belgian Grand Prix win. So Charles actually ended up becoming the first Monegasque driver to win a Formula One Grand Prix, followed by Mercedes driver Lewis Hamilton in second and Valtteri Bottas in third. So coming into quali, Charles had actually started on the grid in first place. And bear with me, but I'm going to say this at the beginning so you understand where I'm coming from. So it kind of seemed like Ferrari and Mercedes were having the same pit stop strategy with kind of making sure that their tires were extended the length of the race as much as possible. So after a yellow flag that lasted from lap 1 to mid lap 4 at the restart, though, Leclerc comfortably led the way while Vettel ended up pitting shortly after for a mistake at the turn La Source. And upon rejoining the grid, Vettel had incredible speed, being around 2 seconds quicker than all of his rivals. That kind of pace meant he was able to assume the lead once Leclerc, Hamilton, and Bottas had to pit. So Leclerc pitted at the end of 21, Hamilton at the end of 22, and Bottas at the end of lap 23. Hamilton lost a second during his stop due to a slow left rear tire change and emerged actually 7 seconds later behind Leclerc. After his pit stop, though, Leclerc had a fastest lap on lap 23, along with the Mercedes cars that started catching Vettel, which is his teammate at his time. And it quickly became clear that Vettel would likely end up having to stop a second time after allowing Leclerc to pass for the lead. So teammates actually ended up helping each other in this race. Anyways, back to the leaders. Hamilton started making gains on Leclerc on the final laps. Hamilton managed, though, to be close by less than a second from Leclerc on the final lap, but not close enough to make a move as the leaders entered the second sector of the final lap. And Antonio Giovanni crashed, which meant they had to slow down due to a yellow flag, which kind of meant the pole standings would remain the same. There was really no way for overtakes to happen. But Leclerc managed to survive the last few corners to become the first driver to claim a maiden win at Spa since Michael Schumacher in the 1992 Belgian Grand Prix. It was also Ferrari's first victory since Räikkönen in the 2018 US GP. And with Leclerc, the Scuderia's 39th winner and Monaco the 23rd nation to win an F1 race. So just some highlights from after the race. His win was dedicated to a longtime friend, Antoine Hubert, driver number 19. Rest in peace, who unfortunately passed away the same weekend in an F2 race. So literally the day before the final race. And one thing to note is when they did the podium, they actually did not even spray champagne. They kind of cheersed each other, took a drink, and walked off in silence. It was literally very muted and was very respectful for Antoine because they did feel that they did not need to celebrate something so monumental that happened that weekend. So even though Charles had won, he was very happy for the win. He did say in an interview, super excited, but wish it was on different terms. So a big moment of the race, and it was so hard to highlight a big moment of this race because honestly, it would just be seeing Ferrari doing so well and seeing Charles' first win, knowing it was his first year with Ferrari as well. But I really respected the podium celebration, to be honest with you. They did for tribute to Antoine and the respect for the F2 series as a whole. And knowing how rough that weekend had to have been for everybody, they also show a close up to Charles singing of his anthem, which was cute, but just rest in peace. And it was a good race. So I would recommend if you're going to watch a race, this would be a good first race to watch, especially if you're a Charles Leclerc fan. But just a forewarning, it is kind of sad at the end. So just be aware of that.
Hello, I'm back. The second race I'm going to cover is the 2020 Sakir Grand Prix, where we saw Sergio Perez gain his first F1 P1 podium finish. Now, the race was absolutely wild. We saw Checo quickly drop to last in the first lap because of a collision between Ferrari's Charles Leclerc and Red Bull's Max Verstappen on turn 4 because he got tapped by Charles and just went straight into the gravel. Now, after a quick stop for some mediums, we saw him fighting back to the top where we saw him go P9, and by lap 44, he was gaining on Mercedes and he was back to taking P3. Now, at lap 55, this is where we saw Nicholas Latifi from Williams pull to the side of the track and out of the race, causing a virtual safety car. But don't worry, this didn't stop Checo. He kept his pace and he was holding on to that race spot in P3. Now, the second safety car, this is where things get interesting, and this is where some good action happens for Checo. Following Jack from Williams, who wiped the front wing off his car and ducked into the pits for the new one, we saw George, who was covering for Lewis during his COVID sickness as a loan from Williams, go into the pits, and we witnessed Mercedes give him the wrong tires on lap 62 of 87. Now, this was then followed by a puncture that left him at P9 at the flag. And what does this have to do with Checo? This gave Checo the win because Mercedes' trash day was Checo's treasure. As the race restarted with Checo in the front, we saw both the Mercedes DNF, and he got to enjoy a nice little cruise to P1 position after his 190th F1 start. Dear God. At the time, Checo was actually with Racing Point, currently known as Aston Martin, and he was actually able to beat his teammate Lance Stroll, who finished in third, and Esti, who was in Renault, now AlphaTauri, who finished in second. Now, this race win is actually what I think set up Checo for his position in Red Bull today, because after this, we saw him go from a driver who had no seat for the following season to Max's teammate. I never imagined that someone so high in the leadership would be without a seat, considering he was holding 4th position with that win in the championship. But considering the options during the season, that seemed the only one that was possible. It's been interesting to see the butterfly effect that a race can have on a career, and I think this was a really emotional one for him because if you saw him on the podium, you'll see his reaction is very heartfelt. So please watch this. The race is a 10 out of 10, and honestly, there's a lot that I didn't talk about. There's a drama between the Red Bull Max and Ferrari Charles crash, and we have Checo being in the mix, of course, which is how he got from 18th to P1. There's also the really big story with Mercedes drama with George scoring his first points, and of course Esteban also gaining his first podium. So besides Checo, there's a lot to watch out for.
And now we're going to talk about the 2020 Italian Grand Prix, where Pierre Gasly ended up getting podium. So this was actually an incredible 2020 Italian Grand Prix where we saw AlphaTauri's Pierre Gasly claim his first Formula win with Carlos Sainz in second and Lance Stroll in third. So Pierre actually started the race in the midfield, but the race kind of got a little crazy when a safety car was brought out as Kevin Magnussen's car had to be recovered due to an incident. But with Hamilton diving into the pit lane when it was closed due to the accident, as did Alfa Romeo's Antoine Giovanni, he was handled a penalty, which, by the way, he was in first place at that time, and he ended up actually having to serve that penalty later on in the race. Mind you, Lewis was the race leader now, and so that required the grid to start shifting. Once the race was restarted, on lap 28, following a 25-minute red flag period after Charles Leclerc crashed heavily into the Parablanca turn. Part 2 of the race got underway after, the red flag was lifted, and starting on lap 28 with the top 10 looking like this. And I'm not going to say all top 10, sorry. But Hamilton, with the penalty hanging over him, he was still in first, which he was obligated to serve within 3 laps. Stroll, Gasly, Raikkonen, and Giovanni. Also, with the penalty, Sainz, Norris, and so on from there. So Gasly was in third by this time. But now we're going to fast forward to Gasly in first. Fighting through the grid to get there with 10 laps to go, Gasly was holding on well at the head of the pack with a near 3-second gap to Sainz, who was in second, who had a similar advantage to Stroll, who was now up to P3, with Norris holding on from fourth and Bottas in fifth. With Gasly getting P1, it became France's first win since 1996, while it was effectively the AlphaTauri squad's second Monza win after Vettel triumphed for Toro Rosso back in 2008. After the race, though, the Italian anthem rang over the sobbing AlphaTauri's mechanics as Carlos Sainz, the future Ferrari driver, took an incredible career best second place, and a disbelieving Pierre Gasly sat on his own incredible podium, swinging the champagne actually back and forth and reflecting on a maiden F1 victory at the end of a terrible last 18 months. There was no doubt that race day in Italy had witnessed something very special indeed in the history of the sport. So if anybody has taken some time to dive into the Pierre Gasly story, he jumped around quite a bit for a little bit with his previous team to Red Bull to back to his previous team, and he was suffering from some stuff. But I think him getting this podium for the first time actually proved to himself that he was worth it, and which is why you see him on the grid he is today, because he stayed there and kept pulling. Big moment is, I'm just going to read this quote. Honestly, it's unbelievable. I'm not realizing what's happening right now. It was such a crazy race, and then we capitalized on the red flag. This is what Pierre Gasly said. I would honestly say, if you're going to watch a race, this is a crazy good first race to watch because it highlights so many different things that a race could have, from a yellow flag to a red flag to a race stop, a restart, penalties, midfield action to podium wins from the midfield, which you don't see very often. And so if you're going to watch a race, I would say that this would be a good first race to watch to get an understanding of the craziness that sometimes the sports go through.
So Esteban Ocon's maiden win was a race for the history books, to say the least. So much happened during the 2021 Hungarian Grand Prix, so let's just get into it. We saw Esteban start the race in 8th place. Meanwhile, Lewis was at pole, followed by Valtteri in P2 and Max in P3. The race started with many collisions just at the first turn. There was the famous bowling incident where Valtteri collided with Lando, who then collided into Max. And afterwards, Valtteri continued the chaos bowling and collided into Checo. Drivers like Lance were trying to avoid the incident, and he himself ended up colliding with Charles. Danny Rick spun out, and sadly, Checo had to DNF, and the safety car was brought out, but only for 2 laps because Lando also DNF'd this race. At the restart of the race, Lewis was the only driver to start back on the track while the rest were starting from the pits for new tires. Before the restart, an unsafe release happened from Kimi Räikkönen where he collided with Nikita Mazepin. And for 4 laps into the restart, Lewis pitted into the pits for new tires and Esteban was leading the race. Thanks to some great strategy calls and defending from Alonso, SD was able to take the win with Vettel in P2 and Lewis in P3. Now, during the post-race interviews, Esteban did credit his former teammate Fernando for defending Lewis towards the end of the race. So we love some teammate love right there. However, unfortunately for Valtteri and Lance, since they did cause those chaotic collisions, they were each given a 5-place grid penalty. And Sebastian was disqualified after the race due to the stewards not be able to get some fuel samples from his car, moving Lewis into P2 and Carlos into P3. But Esteban was not affected from this, thankfully. Now, some fun facts about this race. This was not only Esteban's first win in Formula One, but also the first win for Alpine since the 2013 Australian Grand Prix, when the team was formerly known as Lotus. This was also the first time a French driver won for a French team powered by a French engine since Alain Prost in the 1983 Austrian Grand Prix in Renault. That was a mouthful to say.
Let's start off with the reminder that the 2022 Sao Paulo GP almost didn't happen because of safety concerns after their election. I'm pretty sure they decided to go on with it like a week prior, meaning George Russell could have missed out on his winning race. He qualified P3 this weekend and went on to win the sprint race the next day, which got him P1 for the race. And honestly, I already forgot the old sprint weekend format completely and had to stop for a good 20 minutes wrapping my head around George qualifying P3 but being P1. I also don't know how I ended up picking the 2 races that were very much chill for the driver in the lead. There was only a few laps that George wasn't in the lead, and it was just Lewis in front of him until he pitted for new tires, bringing old Georgie boy back to the front. This was almost a one full safety car race caused by K-Mag and Danny, but there were 3 other crashes, or little love taps, that happened which didn't cause anything really. The next safety car started as a virtual one because Lando lost power. Sad times having to see him sit alone again off the track. But anyway, back to George. His only real nail-biter moment during the race was when Perez would get DRS, but the young Brit kept him in second each time. Mercedes did tell both drivers that they could race each other once they were back to being 1-2. Last year, watching that, I know I fully expected to see Lewis go really hard and overtake George within, honestly, minutes or seconds. But seeing George keep his teammate in second was incredible, meaning when both drivers crossed the finish line, you got to see how happy the Mercedes garage was for that 1-2. I mean, after the season they had, it literally just made me so happy for them. And post-race, I just love team radios, especially wins, because just the screaming that they do, it's just a bunch of grown men yelling at each other, and I love it because they're so happy. And especially with the emotional one from George, he has no shame. He just lets the team know he's going to need tissues because he's already crying under that helmet. I even needed to dab away tears, but I am an emotional girl, so when happy things happen for people, I just would be surprised if I didn't tear up. The big moment that I loved from this race, I mean, listen, keeping your 7-time world champion teammate behind you, especially at the end where they were both told to race, huge moment. Honestly, I was so proud of George while watching this race back even a year later.
Now, I'm going to round us out with the 2022 British Grand Prix and Carlos Sainz's first win. He got his maiden pole position this race during quali after it was interrupted by a yellow flag. But on race day, he is starting in pole, but sadly, Max did take the lead from Carlos at the start, while Lewis Hamilton moved up to third. We did see quite a few race incidents. This was the race that we saw the accident with Pierre, Zhou, and George within like the first 10 seconds of the race, where Zhou's car was launched in the air and he ended up landing in the small gap between the fence and the tire barrier, stopping on its side with the cockpit up against the backside of the tire barrier. I know we all remember watching that race and watching that accident either during the actual race or in the Drive to Survive episodes. But that race really is just a heart and throat kind of moment. That crash in particular just always kind of makes everyone stop and take a second. The race order was restarted to the set grid order, as it wasn't really possible to accurately determine the running order at the time of the red flag. Now, with the restart, Carlos was able to retain the lead at the start before being passed by Max once DRS was enabled. Verstappen did later overrun some debris, which resulted in a loss of pace, and Red Bull actually, after the fact, realized that it had caused floor damage, and that was causing the loss of pace. We did also see Esti Besti suffer a fuel pump problem and stop on the track, which caused another safety car that allowed everybody to go to the pits. We did see the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc stay out and be told not to pit by Ferrari. He led the restart but was quickly passed by Carlos Sainz. Again, this was all seemed to be very typical Ferrari fashion. And continuing with the Ferrari motives or moments, Ferrari made the call on the pit wall to swap their drivers on lap 31, with Charles complaining on the team radio that he was quicker than his teammate, which he claimed could cost him track position to Lewis once the Mercedes driver emerged from his pit stop. But in the end, we did see Carlos win his first Formula One race, becoming the 112th winner in the history of the championship and the second Spaniard to win a Formula One race after Fernando Alonso, who was the first Spaniard to win a race in 2013. He was also the first driver who had his maiden win at the British Grand Prix, the other being Johnny Huber in 1995. In the end, we saw this podium be Carlos in P1, Perez in P2, and Lewis in P3, who also ended up getting the fastest lap of the race. This, for me, has to be one of my favorite podiums because you can just really see how happy Carlos was. You can see in the pictures, he's just beaming and so very ecstatic, and it just really warms my heart so very much. Now, if you've listened to us for a little bit, you do know that we love fun fact. While I wouldn't necessarily call this a fun fact, it is something to note with this race, especially if you do go back to watch it. During the race suspension, there was a group of Just Stop Oil supporters who actually walked onto the track and sat down on the tarmac. They were actually later arrested by the police, but it is something that did happen during the race. There are a few of the drivers who supported the cause, but they did agree that people should not have put themselves at risk of physical harm by going down onto the track.
That's quite interesting. But to kind of round this out, we're going to talk about pre-outro, and we're going to talk about a motorsports fun fact of the day. So with today's episode being all about first podiums, I thought, why not bring up the first ever champagne spray in Formula One? This happened back in 1967 when Dan Gurney sold Ford Motorsport Company CEO Henry Ford II and the team owner Carroll Shelby, their wives, and a couple journalists who doubted the win during the podium celebration, to which he shook up the bottle and started spraying them with champagne. And from there, the rest is history.
Who doesn't love a trip down memory lane? Because I know I sure do. Which driver has your favorite first win? Or who can you not wait to finally see their win? Let us know on our socials. Everywhere we are at Paddock Girls Podcast, except Twitter. There you can find us at Paddock Girls Pod. And also, don't forget to share, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen, like Apple Podcast or Spotify. And as always, for this summer break, the countdown to lights out continues. 18 days to go. Thank you so much for joining us in the paddock. See you next time. Bye, Craig.
See you later, Craig.
Bye, Craig.
Bye, Craig.
Bye, Craig.